national survey that we've been running really since October 2020, called the Cultural Participation Monitor. And this survey is designed to be representative by region, by age, by gender, by particular types of audience group, and so forth. And we've run it in a whole series of waves through the last couple of years to get a sense of where the overall public is at in terms of confidence to attend, engagement behaviour of different sorts, as well as a range of other attitudes and beliefs. So that's what I'm going to be talking based on, but I'm particularly going to be talking based on the most recent wave of the monitor from March this year. So it's four months back in terms of the data, so things will have been moving a little bit with the public, but what we've seen really throughout this process is that a lot of the differences we see between different groups of people sort of continue to be there, albeit in sort of different at different absolute levels as we go through. Now, I should also say in relation to this that the overall monitor, the first 5 waves were part of an academic project with the Centre for Cultural Value, University of Leeds. But this latest wave, we're continuing with the monitor because we've had lots of feedback about how valuable it is. But this latest wave, we've been able to boost the sample based on support from Vocalise. The charity that works providing accessible support for performing arts. So thanks to them really, and indeed partnership with them in terms of some of the analysis, we've been working up these findings. So credit where it's due on that one. So just to say, we're looking at the whole population. We've got lots of tracking over time. It's linked to different audience groups, what we use called audience spectrum. It was part of this project. There's loads of other reports and analysis if you're interested. And indeed, it's possible to partner with us on further waves of this in the future if you individually or collectively are interested. Do please just ask me. But we're looking at cultural engagement in the broadest sense. So in person, online, in terms of active hands-on engagement, really sort of before, during, and looking beyond COVID. Across a wide range of areas. So specifically, for the purposes of this, we looked at boosted sample, thanks to Vocalise. We've looked at people who have said they are deaf, disabled, or with a long-term health condition. And as a follow-up to that, we then asked which of these particular impairments or health conditions applied. And of course, there's lots of overlap between these. So people weren't just picking one necessarily, they're often picking a couple or even more. It's possibly worth saying, just as a little tangent, that we are, of course, really conscious of the importance of social model of disability as opposed to a health-based model of disability. It's only in cases like this where we're looking to compare to external data sets like the census, which is still used on the old model, and indeed where we're trying to identify barriers to engagement that sometimes we're using this language as opposed to other language. But just to caveat that before we start. Anyhow, just to give a sense of the different people that we were speaking to, about a fifth of our total sample said they were disabled. So that's obviously several hundred respondents given the size of that overall wave. And quite substantial proportions of those, over a third saying they had anxiety or depression, or indeed other impairment or health condition, but also quite a lot of people talking about mobility difficulties and others. So there is quite a broad spread of different types of experiences of disability in here. We've generally speaking kept all disabled respondents together in one group. On occasion, we've split them out into groups, some of which are kind of quite clear and logically intuitive. Others are kind of groups which gather together other categories we haven't then included in those kind of nice, more logical groupings. So we'll see that in later on. Just a little bit of background is to say that historically there's been quite a lot of difference in terms of the proportion of the disabled population who've been engaging with arts and culture as defined by the Taking Part survey by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport relative to non-disabled people. So there was been virtually a sort of 10% gap in proportions engaging. That progressively has decreased over time. So there's a good news story there that the arts have become, I think, yes, a little bit more inclusive in terms of disability. But also, if you compare it to other activities, so this is now from the Cultural Participation Monitor, you can see that there's really very little difference in terms of engagement levels between disabled and non-disabled people. For those arts-based activities at the top, there's much more difference when you look at some of those other kind of popular activities further down, of course, with particular gaps in things like sport. I do know, of course, in an earlier session, you were talking about the benefits of sport and leisure and outdoors and nature and ways of increasing engagement and the value of that engagement. But nonetheless, there are sort of slight differences in engagement level. So if that's the background and the good news, I guess what that flags is that any challenges thrown up by COVID are undoing potentially an existing positive or more positive scenario. And those negative background and negative effects have, of course, been substantial. You'll have heard all sorts of things about that already today, I'm sure. And the most obvious ones are, of course, things around health and around shielding, around isolation, and so forth. But there are a few other things that we've pulled out in the Cultural Participation Monitor that could also be sort of useful to factor in. And by a sort of odd coincidence, most of these measures are about 10% difference for disabled and non-disabled people. So it's kind of quite an easy way of keeping track of them all. So I guess at a really broad level, we asked people, how satisfied are you with life compared to before the pandemic? Because that kind of helps gather up all sorts of particular things that might be affecting people. And you can see that really quite high proportions of disabled people are reporting being less satisfied with life than they were before the pandemic. It's high for everybody, but it's 10% higher for disabled than non-disabled people. We also know there have been lots of financial impacts, and bearing in mind this is March, cost of living was starting to come through, but it wasn't maybe quite flashing on the radar as much as it is now. But again, almost half of disabled people saying that they're financially worse off compared to before the pandemic. That's even higher than the sort of big third of non-disabled people. As a clear result of that, people are saying, yes, we expect to spend less on entertainment and leisure in the future. And again, it's about 10% higher when you're looking at disabled people as opposed to non-disabled people. So again, there's a constriction in people's circumstances, which flows through into cultural spend. And here is something which is not so much about a negative impact, but it is a clear difference, which is that there are substantially higher proportions of disabled people who work from home and, expect to work from home in the future relative to non-disabled people. So again, it's slightly more than 10% this time. So it's 32 compared to 20. And indeed, there's a similarly high gap, 12% gap, in terms of whether people prefer to work from home rather than work from the office. So we would expect working from home in its increasing levels to have all sorts of knock-on effects in terms of cultural engagement. And indeed, we've got a separate report about that that's on our website. But all of those things are more pronounced when we talk about disabled people as opposed to non-disabled people. Okay. So, given all of that as the kind of background and where people are at, we can take that and look more specifically about what does that mean for arts and cultural engagement. And here we have split everything in a slightly kind of, is it higher, is it lower, kind of Bruce Forsyth way, into a whole range of things which are more likely for disabled people, and then a whole load of things which are less likely for disabled people. So, generally speaking, disabled people perceive or recognise much greater risks around COVID. So they're more worried about falling ill with COVID, and obviously, it has clearer, more negative health outcomes, and a greater sense that there is risk around COVID from doing various activities. So we looked at the general population and perceived risk levels of general day-to-day activities, attending indoor events, attending outdoor events, and essentially for both disabled and non-disabled people, indoor events were seen as the most risky, outdoor events were seen as the least risky, and everyday activities were somewhere in between. But notably, the proportions are around double in terms of perceived high levels of risk for disabled people. So real sense that there is risk around cultural engagement, and that we should be doing something about it. So most people, well, I think on average it's around 50-something%, are saying that we should do everything we can to reduce COVID, but that's particularly high for disabled people. And it's even higher if we focus just on the particular subgroups that people who have impaired breathing and or mobility as an impairment or as a difficulty. So we can see that for certain groups, it's really, really kind of prominent. Relatedly, it's not just the event itself that people are worried about. So people are also worried about traveling to events. And again, it's about double the proportion who strongly agree that they feel nervous about it. Unsurprisingly, given all of that background, we do expect to see an impact in terms of engagement. And indeed, that's what people are reporting themselves. They're much more likely, or substantially more likely to say that they expect to attend events less often than they did previously, by, again, a sort of similar kind of getting on for 10% margin. So that gap that we saw narrowing before is likely to be opening up again into the future. However, there is a little bit of a different story to tell about digital, and we'll come on to that a bit more later. But essentially, there is a little bit more digital engagement amongst disabled people. Okay. But given all of those things, the less likely side of that is that people are less likely to feel they're back to normal. So quite a lot of the non-disabled population was starting to say, even back in March, yeah, we're sort of, we're getting back to normal attendance. We're kind of doing what we want to do when we want to do it without particular concern about COVID. Again, it's 10% lower when we talk about disabled people. And the one that's really key, we asked people, and we've asked this right through the cultural participation monitor, we've asked people if there was something you were potentially interested in, which of these statements would apply to you? Would you be happy to attend? Would you attend with reservations? Would you, etc. With more, greater degrees of caution as we go down that list. And it's that happy to attend proportion that we've been tracking particularly, and it really struggled to get up to a third of the overall population. Really quite late into the process. It was only really when we got into this last wave in March, where finally we hit over 40% of people saying they're happy to attend. So it held sort of at a third or lower. It had kind of nudged up before the Omicron wave, but then we think it probably came back down again. However, for disabled people, again, it's 12% lower. So it's a similar kind of reduction. And a way of contextualizing that difference is that if we think about the difference of general experience in terms of being comfortable to attend arts and cultural events back in last autumn when things were only just starting to open up again, and March when we'd had the sort of whole peak and then that dying away again and everything feeling much more open up and various testing regimes cancelled and so forth, that was really quite a big shift for the general population in terms of their feeling and attitude. But disabled people in March were reporting the same levels of being happy to attend that non-disabled people were reporting back 6 months earlier. So it's that kind of shift that we're talking about in terms of difference of perception. So there we are. So that's the end of my sort of higher or lower Bruce Forsyth impression for you. And I'm now just going to say a few things about attitudes to safety measures and then going on to talk about access measures as well. So with safety measures, the overall picture is pretty straightforward in that we asked people how important various different safety measures were in terms of dealing with COVID. And lots of people thought they were very important. Even more people thought they were very or quite important. And the proportion for people who are disabled is that kind of 10%-ish higher again across the board. So pretty much most of these are in the same sort of rank order in terms of how important they are, and they're substantially higher for disabled people. For some, there's maybe a bigger difference in those who think that's very important. So things like info on safety measures, or things like enhanced ventilation, particularly key. It's highest for everyone. It's particularly high. Crowd management, clearly, that probably has more of an impact for those with mobility challenges as well. So we're seeing quite a kind of a big difference between disabled and non-disabled people in terms of desiring those measures. Of course, many of those measures are starting to be phased out or reduced in many cases. That will, of course, then have a knock-on impact on disabled audiences in terms of willingness to attend, comfort attending, and indeed the health impacts and so forth. So we've seen bigger impact. We've seen a greater feeling of risk. We've seen the desire for greater safety measures, and really that flags the importance of reopening processes and ongoing engagement being inclusive. So we would recommend that we shall not be removed work, but also that there is that risk of it increasing as we go, as lots of attendance changes back to some of those measures not being in place when they're still desired by disabled people. Okay. In terms of access measures, I'm going to skim over this relatively lightly. Obviously, you'll have access to these slides afterwards, and so I thought it might be useful to have access to the information. But really, the key thing to flag here is that when we asked people whether they felt that certain accessibility measures were essential or desirable or neither, really quite large proportions of the population were expressing a desire for access measures, really whether or not they were themselves disabled. So we can see getting on for, well, certainly 40% of the population saying that accessible information would be at least useful. Similarly, relaxed performance and settings, similarly, information about seating, kind of knowing where the seats were, the sort of leg room, comfort, access, and so forth. And that's sort of true across the board. Obviously, certain things are much more specific, so they have higher proportions of disabled people wanting them, like wheelchair access, hearing loops, BSL. But nonetheless, it's still relatively, larger chunks of the population are at least finding it desirable. So on this chart, disabled people are the dark bars, non-disabled people are the lighter bars, and the reddy pink are essential, and the blue are desirable. So you can kind of see there's kind of substantial numbers right the way down. But also worth noting that in many cases, there are more people who aren't disabled who nonetheless still consider these measures to be essential or desirable. So really it is about the whole audience as well as being vitally important for disabled people themselves. And here then are the equivalent proportions split out just for disabled people. You can see loads of people wanting some of these top rating measures. Some of the lower ones, there's much less variability between whether it's essential or desirable, because if you need wheelchair access, you're much more likely just to need it. It's not a kind of either or, nonetheless. And then there's the equivalent for non-disabled people. So again, lower levels, but still substantial. So where that leaves us in terms of that is that access measures are essential for many, desirable for many more, and that's true for non-disabled, but also disabled people. Sorry, the other way around. So although the ranking is similar, it's worth noting certain things which are particularly important, because clearly we've only asked essential or desirable. We've not gone into the nuance of it, but certainly some of those things are obviously more essential than others. And worth being aware that sometimes people, although we asked about people's own engagement, they could well be reporting on behalf of people that they would want to attend with, and therefore if those facilities aren't available, it doesn't work for them either. So, so if we've seen that we've got the kind of greater desire for safety measures, greater sense of risk and concern, desire for wide level of access and inclusion measures, the final thing I'll touch on is looking at digital in the mix. So, as I hinted, there have been slightly higher levels of engagement by disabled people than non-disabled people. That was true before COVID, so a few percent more engaging online. It was true in terms of the amount those people who did engage were engaging. So disabled people were more likely to have engaged more, if that makes sense, albeit really focused on certainly particular subgroups. But we can see this pattern probably most clearly if we zoom in on one particular type of online engagement. So here we've got online performances, and you can see that the proportion of people that had done these before COVID who were disabled, 25%, rose 5% to 30%. So, quite a big jump. It's a similar growth, but from a lower base for non-disabled people, so 23 to 27%. And it's that kind of pattern we see, that it's not that it's growing more for disabled people, but that it started higher and grew at least the same. So disabled people were more likely to engage online, and that was true for any activity. It was true for very specific activities, and indeed they're more likely to have future plans. For all these things, though, the gaps are relatively small. So we think they're there, but they're on the kind of borderline of statistical reliability. It's sufficiently consistent that I suspect there is an effect, but it's worth being aware. We're not talking about massive differences, but of course what we are seeing is lots of the other ways of engaging in terms of in person. There are clear disincentives and reductions of willingness to attend in person. So if you like, this becomes relatively more important because it is the way to engage when there's other ways of engaging are taken away. The other thing that might be quite interesting for you in terms of working with local organisations is that online is more important for disabled people in terms of accessing local organisations than it is for non-disabled people. So a higher proportion of people who were interested in engaging online had done it with local organisations than amongst non-disabled people. And again, that varied for different types of activity, but it was a substantial difference across the board. That could be about online being a better way of staying locally connected for those with disabilities. Worth bearing in mind. So very briefly, partly because this is one of those cases where you ask a survey question, you get the answers back and realize that the question didn't quite hit the mark. So I'm being very honest in terms of sharing our failing on this one, I guess. But we asked people who had some interest in continuing digital engagement, do you think it's basically you're going to substitute it for your in-person visits? And there weren't huge differences, again, between disabled and non-disabled people, but some suggestion that disabled people may be more likely to be substituting digital activity for in-person engagement. A bit, but not a lot. Relatively lower percentages, 15% compared to 19% in the red there, who said they would just stop the digital and go back to in-person. But most people anyway are expecting more kind of blended engagement into the future. So digital plus in-person is quite an important combination, I think, for lots of people as we go ahead. And there is some difference when we look at particular subtypes of disability, but not huge. And again, with slight caveats around the question. What we can suggest, though, is that people with sensory or cognitive disabilities are relatively less likely, we think, to combine digital with in-person. They're relatively more likely to be substituting and sort of staying away. But those with anxiety and depression and other mental health conditions, it's more of a kind of mix and match. So that there's a higher proportion there saying, well, we'll substitute sometimes and other times we won't. And they're kind of, I guess we'll do what feels right at the time. So that's a little overview then of some of the broad brush digital picture. Slightly higher levels of engagement. We think it's going to persist. It's obviously relatively more important given that in-person engagements will be relatively lower. It's particularly key for local organisations and engagement locally and engagement with the local community. Yes, it'll replace some in-person engagement, but really it's about being part of a kind of mixed model engagement that people are looking for these kind of hybrid approaches. And a question I put to you before you put questions to me is perhaps digital both a bit more inclusive in terms of reach, in terms of disability in particular, in terms of the opportunities for accessible platforms, and might it be lower cost per engagement as well as a service to provide? So that's a quick run through of the data we've got.